myth, Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humankind. Fire, as the source of all craft and technologies, symbolizes progress through the arts. Prometheus' punishment, decreed by Zeus, underlines how powerful such knowledge was considered to be. The gods wanted to keep it all for themselves, because art and skill grant what? Power. The adjective rhetoric belongs to the semantic field of speech resist. So, rhetoric literally means the art of speech, the skill of speaking effectively and persuasively. When we think of Homer's Iliad, our imagination goes straight to scenes of war and to extraordinary heroic deeds. We picture brave and ruthless warriors, master of the art of war, the technique. Yet, Homer's heroes are not only skilled fighters. If we look closely at the adjectives used to describe them, we discover that great leaders must also excel in the art of speech. A true hero should not only be a strategist but also an orator, capable of addressing embassies, councils, or armies with words that persuade, inspire, and command. So a little bit of Greek, but with this translation of here. So here we are in the third book of Homer's Iliad, where the ancient Trojan Antenor describes the different styles of speech of two heroes that are Menelaus and Odysseus. But when they began to weave their words and speeches before us all, Menelaus spoke fluently, his words running on, few but very clear, for he was neither long-winded nor at a loss for words, though in truth he was the younger man. But when the resourceful Odysseus rose to speak, he would stand there, looking down, his eyes fixed upon the ground, holding his scepter firm and still, neither leaning it forward or drawing it back, appearing like some dull-witted fellow. So he was like uno scemo, no? You will have thought him a surly man, Homer says this, or quite a fool. But when he sent forth the great voice from his chest, and his words fell thick and fast like the snowflakes of a winter storm, then no mortal man could rival Odysseus. Oh, mais o menos. It's not so. In this celebrated passage from Iliad 3, Homer offers one of the earliest and most vivid literary portraits of contrasting rhetorical styles, dramatized through the figures of Menelaus and Odysseus. The poet's focus is not merely on verbal eloquence, but on the interplay between speech, gesture, and appearance, the embodied dimension of rhetoric. Menelaus speaks epitrocaden fluently, yet his speech is described as paura menalla mala ligeos, few words but very clear. Homer thus emphasizes a simplicity and lucidity that accord with the Spartan king's character, concise, unadorned, effective without display. His rhetorical ethos is transparent, reflecting a speaker whose authority derives from integrity rather than verbal artifice. Odysseus, by contrast, stages a paradoxical performance. His initial demeanor, eyes cast down, scepter motionless, posture unassuming, suggests silence, even awkwardness. The simile, like an ignorant man, underscores the deceptive modesty of his bearing. This physical restraint creates a powerful moment of tension. The visual rhetoric of humility prepares the audience for the sudden transformation when he begins to speak. At that instant, the gesture falls away and the voice itself becomes his chief instrument of persuasion. His words, compared to winter snowflakes, convey not only abundance, but the force or natural inevitability of his eloquence. Homer thus juxtaposes two modes of rhetorical presence: Menelaus' measured clarity, marked by steadiness and restraint, and Odysseus' theatrical self-control, where the power of speech erupts from apparent stillness. The passage reveals an acute awareness of rhetorical performance as a synthesis of lexis and hypocrisis, speech and delivery, anticipating later Greek reflections on the art of persuasion as both verbal and physical. So let's have a look to the official birth of rhetoric. In defining each historical phenomenon, ancient Greeks didn't like blurred lines. They preferred to find a precise starting point. This is the reason why, according to ancient tradition, the origins of rhetoric should be traced to two Sicilian rhetoricians of the 5th century BCE, Corax and Tisias, who were said to have formulated the first rules of rhetorical discourse. Their central idea, pay attention here, was that what seems true is more important than what is true. An insight that would deeply influence the Sophists. Others, instead, credited Empedocles of Agrigento, a philosopher of the same period, as the true father of rhetoric. Yet, as with most cultural phenomena, rhetoric had no single birth act, obviously. Such labels are convenient historical convention, but in reality, rhetorical skill had long been valued before formal theory emerged. As we have seen, already in Homeric epic, commanders were expected not only to be brave warriors and noble kings, but also eloquent speakers capable of addressing their troops persuasively. A crucial turning point in the development of Greek reflection on language, and thus of rhetoric itself, was the changing view of the relationship between word and object. In the archaic age, it was believed that names were bound to things by a natural and an unequivocal connection. One word for one thing and one thing for one word. It sounds strange to us, but it is so. This view assumed that the bond between name and object was ontological, that the name revealed the essence of the thing itself. However, reality showed otherwise. There were numerous asymmetries, homonymy, polysemy, synonymy. Initially, such irregularities were justified through etymological fictions, explaining, for example, why a single deity might bear several names, each reflecting one of their attributes. For example, Pherecydes of Syro explains that Ctonia, the goddess, is also called Gea, heart, because Zeus gave her the heart as a gift. By the 5th century BCE, thinkers like Heraclitus still held that words were naturally linked to things, but his notion of constant change of reality opened the way to a new conventionalist understanding of language, one that saw that connection between word and things as a matter of human agreement rather than nature. Parmenides and Empedocles in 5th century BCE were the first to state explicitly that names depend on human decisions. This conventionalist perspective was fully developed by the Sophists, who made language itself a field of inquiry and power. For them, rhetoric became a techne, an art form governed by rules, whose purpose was not truth, but effective and persuasive discourse. So, let's have a look to the sophistic revolution at this point. It is not a coincidence that rhetoric flourished in the 5th century Athens, the cradle of democracy. Here we have an expert of democracy. In a city animated by debates, assemblies, elections, and lawsuits, the ability to speak well was essential for political life. The Sophist, professional teachers of rhetoric, instructed the sons of Athenian elites, those destined for public office in the art of persuasion. Their lessons were expensive, and the very idea of charging for education drew scorn from figures such as the playwright Aristophanes and later the philosopher Plato. So if we teachers are very poor people, thanks Aristophanes and Plato. Among these teachers, two figures stand out, Protagoras of Abdera and Gorgias of Leontini, both active in Athens in the 5th century BCE. Protagoras is often regarded as the father of relativism. His famous statement, "Man is the measure of all things," implies that truth depends on individual perception. What is real is what appears real to each person, to each of us. Logically, this means that there can be no absolute falsehood, since every statement reflects someone's perception and each perception is true. Ethically, it leads to the idea that moral values cannot be fixed once and for all. Protagoras thought that through skillful use of language, one could make the weaker argument the stronger. That even a losing case could be turned into a winning one if argued with sufficient art. He emphasizes the notion of kairos, the sense of appropriateness. The right words must fit the right moment, whether in a concise or elaborate form. He also introduced the concept of orthoepeia. The term is problematic and still not clear to the scholars. However, it probably indicates the correct and proper use of language, insisting that the linguistic correctness is essential to clear thinking. In recent years, Elisabetta Matelli has shown how Protagoras' thought contributed to the evolution from antithesis, the simple juxtaposition of opposing statements, to antilogy, a more complex awareness that two opposing arguments may both be valid, depending on perspective. This marks a crucial step toward critical thinking in Greek intellectual life. For Gorgias, the persuasive power of speech did not depend on truth, but on its internal coherence and form. His treatise on nature presents three paradoxical theses. Nothing exists. Even if something exists, it cannot be understood. Even if it can be understood, it cannot be communicated. Why he said that? This thesis stems from the idea that words and reality are distinct. Hence, it is not possible to communicate reality, since when we communicate, we just communicate words. Gorgias thus transformed rhetoric into a form of verbal magic. He compared words to pharmaca. Gorgias' brother was a scientist. Drugs capable of influencing the soul just as medicine acts on the body. He wrote, "Speech is a powerful lord, which with a small and invisible body accomplishes divine deeds. It can stop fear, remove pain, create joy, and increase pity." To achieve such effects, Gorgias developed a rich and musical prose style, using devices such as parallelism, chiasmus, and antithesis, to enchant the ear and sharpen the argument. His rhetoric exemplified the idea that form itself carries intellectual and emotional power. In 4th century BC, Plato, the famous philosopher, reacted strongly against the Sophist relativism and their manipulation of appearances. In his view, rhetoric, divorced from truth, was dangerous. It could persuade without knowledge, undermining the moral and political order. To counter this, Plato constructed his own philosophical system in which the visible world was only the shadow of the true reality, the eternal real of the form, the ideas, culminating in the form, the idea of the good, il bene. In dialogues such as Gorgias and Euthydemus, he denied that rhetoric could lead to knowledge. However, in Phaedrus, he softened this view, distinguishing between true rhetoric, grounded on knowledge of the soul and of truth, and false rhetoric, which merely manipulates opinion. Plato also introduced dialectic, the art of reasoning through divisions and definitions, what he called diairesis, a process of classification that seeks to understand each concept by distinguishing it from others. For example, human beings are different from animals because they are bipedal and endowed with speech. Dialectic thus became the rational counterpart of rhetoric, the path from speech to truth. In Raphael's school of Athens, Plato points upwards, you can see it by my slide, while Aristotle downwards, an image that captures the differing views of reality. Aristotle, Plato's pupil, turned attention from the transcendent to the empirical. He analyzed the language and logic in systematic ways, distinguishing between individual terms, like Socrates, Valeria, and so on, and universal terms, like man. And he said that since individuals change, scientific knowledge must concern universals. From this insight emerged the syllogism, a logical structure in which, if two premises are true, a conclusion necessarily follows. Though syllogisms do not create new knowledge, they organize reasoning with precision and rigor. So, all animals are mortal. All human beings are animals. So, all human beings are mortal. Aristotle described two scientific methods: deduction, moving from general to particular, and induction, deriving general principles from repeated observation, both foundation of critical thinking to this day. He also identified three main genres of speech: deliberative political persuasion before an assembly, judicial defense or accusation before a court, epideictic praise or blame in ceremonial context. Aristotle also codified the stages involved in composing a speech. Euresis, the search for arguments, that is, for sources from which to draw information, just like we do when we write a thesis or scientific article. Oikonomia, the arrangement of the parts, and then hypocritical technique, the delivery, the manner in which one speaks. For Aristotle, the good orator must combine sound reasoning, credibility, and emotional appeal. He must be not only eloquent, but virtuous, a man whose moral integrity reinforces his words. By the Hellenistic and Roman periods, two stylistic schools competed. The Asiatic, grand and ornate, full of rhythm and emotion, and the Attic, which was sober, concise, and restrained, so the perfect opposite. A balanced compromise was the Rhodian style that sought to unite clarity with grace, a concern that would preoccupy Roman theorists as well. So we are to the famous Cicero. The Roman statesman Cicero stands at the pinnacle of classical oratory. Lawyer, politician, and philosopher, he combined practice and theory in a series of influential works. In the De Inventione, Cicero argues that an orator must master not only words, but also facts. Rhetorical skill alone is not enough without a solid grounding in history, ethics, and philosophy. In the Oratore, he affirmed that eloquence embraces all knowledge, since every discipline depends on language. Innovating upon Aristotelian theory, Cicero described three stages in the preparation of an oratorical speech. The first is invention, corresponding to Aristotle's Euresis, dispositio, like Aristotle's Oikonomia, and then memoria. This is a Ciceronian innovation, consisting of memorization techniques that are essential for enabling the orator having the speech firmly in mind to deliver it with natural ease. For Cicero, the good orator had to shape his speech with regard to the audience for whom it was intended and pursue three aims. The first is probare, to argue his case convincingly, delectare, to create aesthetic pleasure, and flectere, to move emotion. To achieve this, he needed to be able to alternate between three stylistic registers: humble, middle, and elevated. Cicero owns orations, absolute masterpiece that we can still enjoy today, provide a clear example of the practical application of his theory. And to conclude, Quintilian. A century later, Quintilian, we are in the 1st century CE now, born in Spain but active in Rome, became the first state-paid professor of rhetoric, fortunately for us. By his time, the political vitality of oratory had waned under imperial rule, and rhetoric had become primarily a pedagogical discipline, taught through declamation, fictional exercises designed more for aesthetic pleasure than civic engagement. In his monumental Institutio Oratoria, Quintilian set out the complete education of the ideal orator from childhood to maturity. He insisted on the moral integrity of teachers and rejected corporal punishment. Like Cicero, he saw the orator as a man of broad culture, but he gave rhetoric precedence even over philosophy, arguing that without eloquence, the philosopher could not express reason itself. Quintilian shares Cicero's views that style must suit the occasion, aiming to instruct, docere, to move, movere, and please, delectare. He reviewed the great Greek and Latin writers, challenging the assumption of Greek superiority, and recommended moderation between the extremes of Asian exuberance and Attic austerity. Above all, Quintilian believed that eloquence and virtue were inseparable. The ideal speaker, he wrote, must be vir bonus dicendi peritus, a good man skilled in speaking. In that phrase, rhetoric finds its ethical art, speech as an instrument not merely of persuasion, but of wisdom, justice, and civic responsibility. So, let's go to our conclusion. From the Homeric poems to the refined theories of Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian, ancient rhetoric presents itself as far more than a technique of persuasive speaking. It is a disciplined way of thinking that links language reasoning and civic responsibility. The Greeks had already understood that our capacity to speak does not simply transmit thought. It actively shapes it. This is why rhetoric progressively developed alongside logic and philosophy. Persuasion became inseparable from the search for clarity, coherence, and, if the orator is honest, truth. At the same time, ancient authors repeatedly warned that rhetorical power, if detached from knowledge and virtue, can become dangerous. The Sophists revealed the flexibility of language, but figures like Plato and Aristotle insisted that persuasion must be grounded in an honest understanding of reality, of the audience, and of the ethical implications of each argument. Cicero and Quintilian went further, making moral integrity a constitutive element of eloquence. The good speaker must also be a good person, capable of using speech not for manipulation, but for the common good. These ancient reflections acquire renewed urgency in contemporary society. Today's public discourse, shaped by digital media, rapid information flows, and polarizing narratives, amplifies both the potential and the risks of rhetorical skill. The same techniques that enable clear explanation, dialogue, and democratic participation can equally sustain fake news, superficial emotional appeals, and strategic distortions. Recovering the ancient connection between rhetoric, knowledge, and ethics, therefore, becomes essential. To practice rhetoric responsibly means verifying information, structuring arguments rigorously, recognizing the limits of one's claim, and cultivating respect for one's interlocutors. In this sense, rhetoric is not the enemy of critical thinking, but one of its conditions. It offers the tools to argue carefully, to interpret the competing narratives, and to resist manipulation. Studying ancient rhetoric thus helps us understand not only how persuasion worked in the past, but how free and critical thinking can thrive today. It teaches that eloquence without judgment is dangerous, but that eloquence guided by knowledge and ethics is one of the foundations of a healthy community. Thank you so much for your attention.